Our speakers for today are Dr. Pamela Miller and Cisco Mercado. Dr. Pamela Miller founded ACAT in 1997 and serves as executive director. She brings more than 35 years of research, education, and advocacy experience to her present work, and Pam works passionately for environmental and reproductive justice, health, and human rights. In addition to serving as executive director for ACAT, Pamela was elected in 2016 as co-chair of the International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN, which is a network of more than 600 environmental health and justice organizations working in 124 countries. She serves as a principal investigator for community-based participatory research funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Wittenberg University and a master's degree in environmental science from Miami University. Prior to her work in Alaska, she served as Ocean Issues Technical Coordinator for the Washington Department of Ecology and Director of a Marine Science Education Center in Nisqually Reach in southern Puget Sound. She received the Governor's Award for Environmental Excellence in Washington State and came to Alaska in 1989 following the Exxon Valdez oil spill to serve as a research biologist for Greenpeace. We're also joined today by Francisco or Cisco Mercado, and he comes to ACAT with a wealth of experience. Cisco was born and raised in New York City. He is a graduate of Valparaiso University, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Political Science. After his time at Valparaiso University, Cisco went on to pursue his master's degree. At the University of New Orleans, Cisco was able to earn two master's degrees, one in history and the other in political science. During his career, Cisco has worked on several political campaigns and nonprofit organizations in various positions. Cisco moved to Anchorage, Alaska in 2011, where he worked for Campfire Alaska in various positions. During his time in Anchorage, Cisco is currently serving on 4 boards of nonprofit organizations. We welcome our speakers today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you both. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sarah, thank you so much for having us, and hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. And we're gonna do several things today on today's webinar, and then we'll have some time for discussion, questions, and answers toward the end. But this is really a presentation about the Global Plastics Treaty and how nurses can support communities through policy engagement. I'm going to go through some of the history and the status of the treaty, why this is so important to peoples living in the North, and particularly Indigenous peoples of the Arctic. We're going to talk some about the health concerns with regard to plastics, and then talk about how nurses can be engaged in this. And Cisco's going to talk about state policies where nurses can get engaged in states all over the country that are working to get protective policies at the state level on plastics and chemicals. So just briefly about our organization here. We're an environmental justice and health organization. Our mission is everyone has the right to clean air, clean water, and toxic-free food. So I consider that we're an environmental justice research and advocacy organization, also really based in achieving human rights and health. And these are just some of the ways that we do our work. We have community-based research projects. We do a lot of public education and training, organizing and advocacy, and ultimately we work to try to achieve policy change at the local to international levels. This is a report that we published in advance of the 4th negotiating session of the Plastics Treaty, called the Arctic Plastics Crisis. And this is really looking at the intersection among chemicals, plastics, and climate change in the North, and why this plastics treaty is really so vital to peoples of the Arctic and internationally for everyone. So one of the chapters in the report addresses, again, the interlinkages between chemicals and plastics and climate, recognizing that the North and the Arctic serves as a hemispheric sink for persistent industrial chemicals as well as plastics. Indigenous peoples of the circumpolar Arctic have some of the highest levels of these persistent bioaccumulative chemicals of any population on Earth because of this phenomenon that you see here in the lower left-hand corner of the slide called the grasshopper effect or global distillation. So very little manufacturing of chemicals and plastics goes on in the north, but these chemicals and plastics rise on wind and are also carried on ocean currents northward from distances, sometimes hundreds and thousands of miles away, where they tend to concentrate in the bodies of fish, wildlife, and people. And these persistent chemicals tend to bioaccumulate and biomagnify in the food web, and ultimately human beings are at the apex of this food web. And we're also discovering that the mobilization and transport of chemicals and plastics into the north and getting released from sea ice sources and sequestered in sea ice, glaciers, and permafrost, climate warming, which is occurring at a rate about 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, is exacerbating the problem of the mobilization of these chemicals, both into and within the Arctic. I mentioned that the Arctic is a hemispheric sink for chemicals, but it's also become a hemispheric sink for plastics. The Arctic Ocean now contains the greatest concentrations of microplastics on Earth, again, because of this global distillation process or transport mechanism. I'm going to spend a little time just talking about microplastics. I'm sure you're familiar with these. The definition is really these very fine plastic particles less than 5 millimeters, and nanoplastics are even smaller. And all of these sources contribute to the microplastics problem, the degradation of macroplastics from all of these sources, clothing, manufacturing, packaging, building materials, and so on. And we're exposed in all of these different ways through air, drinking water, our food, and household dust. And one of the reasons why we're concerned about microplastics, not just because microplastics can be harmful in themselves when they're incorporated into our bodies, but toxic plastic additives, including plasticizers, flame retardants, and plastic stabilizers, are incorporated into these plastics. And then once the microplastics are in our bodies, these chemicals are then released and we're exposed that way. So we consume a lot of microplastic particles each year, as much as 125,000 pieces. These microplastics are now found in virtually every organ in our body: lungs, heart, liver, kidney, placenta, which is, of course, is especially concerning because these microplastics are then conveyed to the developing child, reproductive organs, bladder, and then as well as breast milk. And the microplastics and the chemicals in microplastics can contribute to a range of health outcomes, adverse health outcomes, including cancers, reproductive problems, including infertility, cardiovascular, and neurodevelopmental harm. So a lot of this is covered in the report that I showed you in the beginning, the Arctic Plastics report. So a huge quantity of microplastics enter the Arctic Ocean every year. And again, the Arctic Ocean has the highest concentrations of microplastics, really surprisingly, of any ocean basin in the world. So you can see, I won't go over all of these numbers here, but measured in the metric tons of microplastics in seawater incorporated into sea ice in the sediments of these Arctic oceans, the Beaufort and the Chukchi Seas off the coast of Alaska. Oops. And it turns out that sea ice, which is melting at a very rapid rate, is a major global sink for microplastics that tend to get sequestered in the sea ice. And as the sea ice melts, these microplastics are then released into very important areas ecologically as well as culturally for traditional fishing and hunting. So along with the microplastics, tons and tons of chemical additives that I mentioned are also transported with plastic debris into the Arctic. And this is just one example. This is a chemical, UV328, a UV stabilizer that's added to plastics that we were able to include for global elimination under the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. This is a chemical that's used in the manufacturing of plastics, and then it's thus transported into remote regions in microplastics. And so microplastics have been found in all of these species, including the major ice seal species, walrus, beluga whales, all these different whale species. And some of these are very important for the traditional diet. And these are found in tissues throughout the bodies of these marine mammals, including the brains and the foreheads of the fatty tissues that are used as a sound lens by the toothed whales. They're very prevalent in Arctic seabirds because, of course, they're plankton feeders, so they incorporate microplastics into their body. And chemicals such as phthalates are then conveyed into the bodies of the seabirds through these microplastics. And they're found very widely in marine fish species, not only in the Arctic, but worldwide. This was a very critical report that was released by the Research Council of Norway last year, also in conjunction with negotiations around the Plastics Treaty. But they did a really comprehensive assessment and found that over 16,000 plastic chemicals are found. So these are not only the plastic polymers, but all of the additives. 25% could be classified as hazardous. But on the other hand, no plastic chemicals were classified as safe because there's so very little data on the toxicity and adverse health effects of these chemicals. So this is really important because this isn't just a plastics treaty, it's also a chemicals treaty. And we're really fighting for a strong plastics treaty that incorporates the toxic classes of chemicals that are used in the manufacturing of plastics, and then also centering health in the plastics treaty. I mentioned UV328. This is again a chemical that we got included under the Stockholm Convention in 2023, and it's a very high production volume chemical. It's used as a chemical additive, and it's especially transferred from microplastics into seabirds because again, they're plankton feeders, so they take in these microplastics as if they were food. And so the microplastics act as little Trojan horses carrying these plastic chemicals like UV328 into remote regions such as the Arctic. This particular chemical has been detected in breast milk. It is a liver and kidney toxicant, and it has endocrine disrupting properties, including anti-androgenic effects. This was a briefing paper that Project Tender, which stands for Targeting Environmental Neurodevelopmental Risks, a group of scientists, healthcare providers, practitioners, and also children's health advocates prepared for the delegates of the Plastics Treaty. And this report really focuses on how plastics and the toxic chemicals in plastics can affect the developing brains of children. This is available on our website and also at Project Tender's website down here in the lower left-hand corner. Some of the findings, and we did a very thorough literature review. So again, these plastic particles are found in women's placenta. As I know that you know, placentas are very important for supporting fetal growth and development. And they are now widely found in women's placenta, and that number has increased. So 60% of placenta samples had these plastic particles in 2006, and by 2021, it had risen to 100%. These microplastics are found in the baby's first stool and in breast milk, as well as infant formula. And very critically, these microplastic particles can cross the blood-brain barrier. So very unfortunately, babies are now entering the world with their brains and bodies contaminated with plastics. These are some of the ways that plastic particles and the chemical additives in plastics can affect children's brain development. So they can penetrate cell membranes and impair placental function. So they can cause adverse effects on fetal growth, brain growth and development, and all of these different types of behaviors, as well as learning and memory and cognitive function. So interestingly, the plastic particles in some of these studies were found in all placentas of low birth weight babies, but only in 10% from normal weight babies. So it's really thought that there's an association between birth weight and the presence of microplastics in the placenta. So again, with higher microplastics exposure, the babies had lower birth weight, length, and head circumference, and lower test scores on the APGAR test. I want to spend just a little time talking about chemical classes in plastics, and particularly, I'm sure that some of you are familiar with these classes of chemicals. The phthalates are added as plasticizers to soften the plastics. The PBDE, or polybrominated diphenyl ether, flame retardants are found. They've been phased out to a large extent, so they're considered now legacy chemicals, but they're still widely prevalent because they're so highly persistent. They're still found in furniture foams, in children's toys, and a variety of household products. And then the bisphenols are also additives to plastics. So these chemicals and chemical classes don't stay in the plastics themselves. They leach into household dust as well as into our foods. They are widely found in pregnant women as well as infants and children. And in toddlers, toddlers have sometimes up to 5 times higher levels of the flame retardants, for example, um, of compared with adults living in the same household, because they're spending a lot of time on the floor doing hand to mouth behavior, and their smaller bodies can take in more household dust through ingestion than adult bodies, and they're passed from mother to child. So why are plastics such a global crisis? Well, we can see, and this diagram is a representation of what industry, from industry itself. So as the demand for oil and gas for direct combustion declines, the industry is banking and investing in using more oil and gas to produce plastics and chemicals. So you can see that these projections show that the industry wants to dramatically increase plastics production over the next few decades, including projections of more than 4 times more plastic production on the planet by 2060. In terms of chemicals, only about 1% of the chemicals that are on the market today are regulated at a global level. And so that leaves about 90%, 99% of the hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are on the market virtually unregulated. So we have a lot of work to do here. So the first priority for the Plastics Treaty is to stave and greatly reduce and eliminate plastics production. One of the demands that we're making in conjunction with the Plastics Treaty that it has to address the entire life cycle of plastics, because from the extraction of oil and gas to disposal, plastics are very harmful not only to the environment, but to human health through production and use. The recycling, which is really a myth since we know that less than 9% of plastics are recyclable, and that's largely because of the toxic chemicals. And then the waste from plastics, when they're incinerated, also highly toxic, producing dioxins and furans. And then a lot of these plastics are transported from from so-called developed countries into the primarily global south. And so we're dumping on a lot of countries that don't have the infrastructure or the means to properly dispose of plastics. IPEN, again, the International Pollutants Elimination Network, last year produced a report with the Endocrine Society, which is the society of endocrinologists and healthcare providers that address the endocrine harms of chemicals and environmental threats. And so this is a very useful report. It's on IPEN's website, and since we won't have enough time to talk about all of the health effects of plastics and the endocrine disrupting chemicals used in plastics, I would refer you to this because I think it's a really excellent resource. But these EDCs are really produced at every phase of the life cycle of plastics. And this is just a quick diagram looking at how these endocrine disrupting chemicals used in plastics can affect our health in men and women. So we talked a little bit about neurological and behavioral disorders, endocrine disorders such as obesity and metabolic dysfunction, and a wide range of reproductive disorders, including infertility and different types of cancers as well. So there's a global scientific coalition, and they, along with other groups of civil society who participate in the Plastics Treaty, are calling attention to the fact that we are in a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and harm to human health, including cancers and reproductive health from chemicals and plastics. And there's a very good article here that's cited from The Guardian. So I mentioned that the oil and gas industry understands that the demand for their fuels will decline. So they are truly investing their time and energy and lobbying very heavily for a very weak plastics treaty because they don't want to be told to have to reduce their production for oil and gas that will be used in chemicals and plastics. These are just some of the reports that IPEN has produced globally, and I should say that IPEN is a network of over 600 civil society organizations, environmental health and justice organizations throughout the world, and I believe now over 120 different countries, and comprised of scientists as well as children's health advocates and environmental justice advocates. So one of the things that IPEN does is to help support local groups in conducting research that then contributes to understanding of how these issues affect us all globally. So I want to talk about the Plastics Treaty, and this is really important. I think this gives me hope, even though the negotiations have not drawn the Plastics Treaty to a close yet. We do not have a negotiated treaty after 6 sessions. But in 2022, the United Nations adopted an historic resolution that calls for a global and legally binding treaty by the end of 2024. So we didn't quite make it. And this is what the resolution looks like. And it's very important that the resolution calls to an end to plastics pollution and the global legally binding instrument. And very importantly, not just addressing the downstream effects of plastics. So not just the waste issues, not just the fact that we have a lot of plastics in our ocean, but addressing plastics throughout their life cycle and the harms that they cause, and calling for sustainable production and consumption. So this is really looking at a circular economy approach whereby we don't have toxic chemicals in plastics, which could improve the reuse and recycling of plastics. But again, it's not so much about waste and recycling as it is about focusing on reducing plastics production. This is just a short recap of the treaty negotiations so far, starting again with the UNEA Resolution 5.2 in 2022, and then there have been several what are called INCs, or Intergovernmental Negotiating Sessions. We just had the most recent one, INC 5.2, in Geneva, Switzerland in August of this year. And I'd say one of the things that really gives me the most hope in all of this is the real power of civil society, and that includes scientists and indigenous organizations and groups of from all over the world who have come, and they show up. We show up to advocate for a strong, enforceable plastics treaty that really does center health, that does not serve the interests of the fossil fuel industry. And I'll say that they've had a lot of power and influence in this, and have influenced a lot of the petro producing states, including the United States. And the United States has not taken a good position on this plastics treaty. They've been very obstructionist and a problem. So it's a handful of countries that are trying to block real progress on this treaty. So it's important for civil society, including scientists and health-based organizations, to show up and fight for what is right. These are some of the recommendations that we've made to the negotiators of the plastics treaty. It really has to be centered in protecting health and the environment, and ending production and use of toxic chemicals in plastics, addressing all the stages of plastics from extraction toward disposal, and banning recycling of plastics, including chemical recycling that simply recycles toxic chemicals into products, often food contact materials. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Cisco.
Yes. Hi, everyone. So, as we all know right now, trying to get legislation on a federal side is very difficult. So, a number of different states have taken upon themselves to address the plastic crisis in their own way. The first one we could do, and a few states have done this, is ban intensely added microplastics in consumer products. So you will find these in paints, toothpaste, exfoliants. Um, these are type of the intensely added use of microplastics does nothing to the products. It doesn't really. There's no benefit to the product. It just makes it makes it feel better. As for a texture added component. Another recommendation is the elimination of unnecessary plastic use, and to promote non-toxic reuse. I think this is vital. There's a number of different areas where plastics are not needed, and there are safer alternatives to be used. Another recommendation is the elimination of the most hazardous plastics, such as PVC, polystyrene, and plastic additives, including plasticizers, flame retardants, and stabilizers. Uh, let's take flame retardants. They do not help in a fire and stuff like that, and those are very harmful chemicals to firefighters. And a lot of these are not necessary, and they're all healthier and safer alternatives to be used. And the last thing is we really need to develop a microplastic testing strategy. And that's really important because we all have microplastics in our body. We really need to test it to see how far the microplastics are in society, and really develop once we test and know how deep the problem is, we can then try to really find real solutions. IPAM. Next slide. So there's a number of states in the lead in passing legislation on the state side. So, for example, New Jersey, California, Colorado, Maine, and Indiana. This is not a red or blue problem. have you seen we have purple states, red states who have enacted legislation that prohibits the use of microplastics in personal care products. So this is not a political issue. This affects everybody, and it doesn't matter where you align on the political spectrum. Some states have also included a prohibition on microplastics in over-the-counter drugs. Um, and Illinois recently just created established legislation to create a standard methodology for testing of drinking water for microplastics. And Rhode Island just recently is the most recent state to pass a bill to prohibit microplastics in personal care products. So on the plastic side, 17 states have adopted 32 policies, and 19 states have introduced 72 different types of legislation policies. And you can find the list on Safer States. Safer States is a coalition of nonprofit organizations throughout the United States that work to really address the harm of plastics and chemicals and help states adopt legislation to pass to regulate these in all areas of the state. Here in Alaska, we're working on a number of different legislations to address microplastics. So right now, we have legislation HB 25, which prevents the use of polystyrene, which most people don't know, styrofoam is a form of plastic. So we're trying to ban polystyrene in disposable foodware, such as restaurant takeout containers. Most people don't know styrofoam is not made to hold food. When the food is hot in the styrofoam, all those nasty chemicals that's in plastic leaches into your food. So this bill will prevent further harm from a significant source of plastic waste. Especially in Alaska, most of our landfills, especially our native villages, are not lined to keep the styrofoam in the landfill. They're not lined. So most of the time when the styrofoam is carried by air, animals eat it and stuff like that. And they are safe for alternatives, widely available, and the cost is really negligible. One piece of legislation that we're working really hard to try to find a sponsor for is it will create a ban of the intentional addition of microplastics in products. So right now, microplastics are found in our food, drinking water, wildlife, and human body. And especially in Alaska, where a lot of our native communities live on subsistence hunting, they are found in our fish, seabird, wars, seals, and whales. And, like Pam said earlier, I'm not going to regurgitate most of the information. Microplastics are found in the women's placentas, in brains, tissues, human male reproductive parts. So it's found in every part of our body, and is in so many different products that we buy over the counter, from personal care to cleaning products and a number of different paints.
And just to wrap up here a little with a few more slides, the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, Dr. Marcos Orellana, has made several reports and declarations about the harm caused by plastics, again, at every stage of the life cycle, that affects not only health, but human rights, from extraction to disposal. And he calls out the particular effects on fence line communities and workers where these chemicals and plastics are produced. And in the second quote here, he's really talking about the extreme importance and urgency of safeguarding human rights for present and future generations, again recognizing that these plastics are transferred from one generation to the next, and they cause intergenerational harm. So a human rights-based approach is really essential to be at the core of this treaty as well. So this is really why we're doing this work. we're calling for a strong plastics treaty that protects the health of children's developing brains and reducing production and use of plastics and generation of plastic particles and preventing harmful effects of plastics throughout their life cycle. And this is also from the Project Tender report as well. These are some quotes from some of the Native leaders that we work with on our community-based research. The first one is from an elder and leader from the Native village of Savunga, Delbert Pungawi, who says, "We are overwhelmed with concern about the health harms associated with climate change, the loss of sea ice and melting permafrost, and the mobilization of chemicals and plastics. These are all interconnected. We are running out of time." And he's really noting the extreme decline in seabird species, in marine mammals, as well as the loss of sea ice and permafrost. And you may have heard we just had a very devastating typhoon here in Alaska, and entire villages have been destroyed. And it's largely because of their vulnerability being on the coast, prone to flooding, melting permafrost, really affecting infrastructure, and it really is having immediate and devastating consequences here. Merla Pasangak is also an elder who advises us on our community-based research on Sivukak, or St. Lawrence Island. We have always been a vigilant people. Our community-based research enables us to be vigilant at the molecular level. And he's referring here to the fact that the tribes of the island of Sivukak, or St. Lawrence Island, have requested us to do biomonitoring, to look at levels of chemicals in blood as well as in the environment. And also, people are extremely concerned about plastics and the connections with plastics and chemicals. And one of our board members said, "We don't eat just one chemical, we eat the whole fish." This really refers to the cumulative effects of all of these impacts: climate, chemicals, plastics in the Arctic. If you haven't had a chance to read this book called Silent Snow, I would really recommend it. It's by the investigative journalist Marla Cohn, who again refers to the great environmental injustice of the chemical contamination of the Arctic and the peoples of the Arctic. This is a traditional whaling vessel here made out of walrus skin, and this is an intergenerational photograph of some of our relatives of Vi Wahi, a staff member of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. This is Annie Aloha, and she was a very respected elder and community health aide in her village of Savunga for many years. And she was the one that drew attention to the long-term harms caused by the military occupation of Sivukak. So not only are the people of Sivukak subject to the long-range transport and accumulation of chemicals carried into this region on wind and ocean currents, but they're also very directly affected by the military contamination there. Sivukak is located about 30 miles from the Chukotka Peninsula of Russia. So during the Cold War and beyond, there were military bases that were built up on the island that displaced the communities and that left a terrible legacy of chemical contamination. And here's our contact information, and we welcome discussion, questions, anything that you'd like to talk about after the presentation. Again, we just thank you so much for having us. Really have loved getting to know the Alliance of Nurses for Healthy Environments, who are also part of Safer States, I should say. And we were just at a meeting together with Sarah last week. But we've worked for years with ANHI because we just have a lot in common in caring about the health and well-being of people and future generations. And ANHI came to Alaska a few years ago, so we did some presentations together. So really, really love what you do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller and Cisco. We so appreciate you offering all this information. Does anyone have any questions for our speakers? I know I have a couple, but I want to open it up to the group. I guess I'll go ahead and just ask my question while others are thinking. So you said there was, Cisco, you said there was some states that had passed intentionally added microplastics legislation. Is there any risk that that could be reversed with any kind of state preemption or things like that? Is that something that nurses could kind of advocate around?
Yes, there is always a risk. There has been a lot of talk right now in DC and in a number of coalitions that we work with about a number of different areas that could be. The chemical industry is really trying to stop states from regulating microplastics and chemicals. So they would rather have it done. They would have rather have state preemption, like basically the federal government limit what states could regulate, what they could control, and really leave up to the federal government to do that and negate a number of different rules, policies, and laws that has been passed throughout the country. And so it's very concerning, and I think it's something that we need to really highlight because it, it's being discussed in some form. The chemical industry is gonna have enough lobby and pull to try to get it voted on in our federal government, and it's something that we really need to keep an eye on and fight against.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I've been hearing with different things as far as food additives, different types of chemicals, and also the potential reopening of things like the Toxic Substance Control Act. So this is really great information. Did anyone have any questions for our speakers? Feel free to come off mute if you don't want to write it in the chat.
Well, Sarah, one of the things I wanted to mention, because this is really about engagement and how nurses can be engaged. And I just wanted to emphasize that this is definitely a global problem, but it's something that we can work together on from the local level to the international level. So, for example, some of the local possibilities are establishing local ordinances. We just began a campaign recently called Plastics Free 907. The idea is to try to get ordinances in Anchorage and other communities around Alaska that would eliminate the use, especially of single-use plastics, and to get businesses to come on board and to try to get them to reduce their use of plastics in favor of safer alternatives. So those are some of the ways that nurses can get involved locally, and then all of the statewide legislation that's going on with our Safer States partners. That's another great way. And I'm really proud to say that we've had a wonderful relationship also with the Alaska Nurses Association that represent about 7,000 nurses throughout the state. And they have always been really good about sending in testimony, presenting testimony, and talking about how this is really important for their patients and the health of the people that they care about. So that's been really important. We know that these plastics don't respect political boundaries. So that's why working at the local to international levels, a really critical thing that we can all do together.
To go off of what Pam said, another way you could get involved locally is plastic bag bans. Anchorage has a ban to ban plastic bags. It's been in effect for a few years now. I know a number of different cities like New York City has those bans. Those are something that can be done on a local level, and it does have in effect because plastic bags are so easy turn into microplastic because people just use it once, throw it out, it goes to the dumpsters, and then it just breaks down to microplastics. And that's something that's a really, I'm not gonna say easy because to get ordinance passed or a bill is never easy, but that's something that anybody can take on and fight for in their community.
No, those are excellent suggestions. And I know we have a nurse on here, and I don't want to put her on the spot, but Dr. Jacobson Van is on here, and I know she worked on a bill that removed DEHP from IV tubing in North Carolina. So, as nurses, we can also, work in our facilities and talk to those who are in purchasing and procurement, to get safer materials and things like that. And those all make a difference because each time we do one of those things, we're educating others about the ingredients in plastics and safer alternatives. So those are great ideas. I put the ACAT website and the IPEN website in the chat. I encourage folks to look at those. There's a lot of great reports, and we're really lucky to have folks like Dr. Miller and Cisco who go to these international conferences and represent, the needs of the people. So thank you so much for doing that and sharing your experiences with us. We really appreciate it.
You're
Are
welcome. We're very glad to do that.
Wonderful. Would you be willing to share your slides? I know our participants are usually very interested in slides. If you could share those with us, and
Yes,
that would be great. Wonderful.
I'll send those to you.
All right. If there's no other questions, please speak up if you have any. But if not, we will be sending out the recording of today. It will be posted on our learning site for review. I know that Dr. Miller and Cisco listed their contact information if any questions come up after today that you want to reach out to them for. But we really appreciate you all joining today for this topic. So thank you so much to our speakers.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you everyone for attending.